It is the Swedish national election this Sunday, September 9th, and here to talk about it is the Angry Foreigner. His links, his Twitter, his YouTube will be in the description box below. He's been a guest on the channel before, and he goes by the name Vlad, which is easier to say than the Angry Foreigner. So, Vlad, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, we're going to get into this over the next half an hour or so. I read an article in Spectator about Sweden just a few days ago, and they talked about this issue, which a lot of people don't talk about, is the fact that Sweden's economy is doing quite well in comparison to a lot of other countries. You know, their unemployment rate is low, the government's running a surplus. In a normal situation, you know, in any major country in the world, under those circumstances, the ruling party, which in this case obviously is the Social Democrats, given that economic situation, they would win re-election quite easily in virtually any other scenario. Why is this not a normal scenario in Sweden?
Well, first of all, I would say that the economy is a very complex issue because, I mean, they're going to use figures and say that our economy is doing great, when really there's a difference between BNP and BNP per capita, first of all. And there's also a difference with how, for example, the Swedish crown is weak, getting weaker. And a bank, one of the biggest banks in Sweden, came out recently and said that immigrants are so overrepresented with unemployment that it's keeping back wage development for all workers in the country. So I don't really believe that the economy is doing as well as they say it's doing, because usually they just, play with definitions and words to make it sound like something else. But when it comes to the Social Democrats, they are absolutely disastrous. I mean, this has been the most unpopular government in many years. And I think with things like, it's been a crazy year because every single globalist, multiculturalist, mass immigration party that have been causing this disaster have now completely flip-flopped. Now they're stealing all of their ideas and their tough and heavy rhetoric from the Sweden Democrats, because that's how little they think of people. They think it isn't the most transparent thing in the book to say what you think people want to hear months before an election and then cancel out on your election promises as soon as you gain power. With the Social Democrats, they've been in charge for the past term. In 2015, Stefan Löfven held this very passionate speech about how his Europe refuses to build walls. We're not going to close the borders.
He's the prime minister, right?
Yeah, he's the prime minister. And so we took in way more migrants than we could handle. And then there was a sex crime epidemic. And then he introduces ID controls. And they tell us that Sweden closed the borders, when in fact, Sweden never closed its borders. In 2017, almost 130,000 residence permits were handed out. That's a historical record. And that happened after we closed the borders. Now, within the next coming 4 years, the Migration Board estimates there's going to be so many migrants coming to Sweden, it's like importing a new Malmö. That's what the Social Democrats want to do, probably because they view immigrants as voting cattle. I mean, no-go zones and ghettos are actually some of the strongest voting holds for the left in Sweden. So it's not weird that they want more migrants. I mean, that's also why we see the left attacking Kanye West and calling people Uncle Tom, because they get angry when you refuse to be their slave. I've gotten this label many times as well. The Social Democrats claim to be for the people and for the workers, but really what they're representing are a kind of big corporation, anyone who hates Swedish culture, and the elite, the global elite. And I think people aren't that dumb. I think people can see through this, and they notice that something is wrong. What they have been promised and what they got are very different things.
Now, let's just run through for people who aren't that aware of the Swedish election. The major parties, the ones that are going to finish, in the top 4 or 5 positions, because we talk about Sweden Democrats a lot. From my understanding, they're not going to form a government because there needs to be a coalition government, and none of the other parties have agreed to form a coalition with the Sweden Democrats, correct?
Yeah, exactly. It's the same phobia as always. The Sweden Democrats, in practice, are really just the Social Democrats 30 years ago, when they actually cared about their people. They're not that extreme, but they have been presented as such. So there's this weird, I like to call it racist phobia, where you invent racism that doesn't exist, and then you're really scared of it. So what's probably going to happen is that we're going to see some kind of, we're not going to come very far. It's not going to be that big of a change from the last election, where they ended up isolating the Sweden Democrats from influence in this large coalition. And there might be an extra election, actually. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a chaotic government where nothing is getting done and they call out a new election. So I'm not that hopeful for the election per se, rather the long-term perspective in the future.
But from the polls that I've seen, the Sweden Democrats, correct me if I'm wrong, but they got 14% in the last election back in 2014. Now it looks like they're going to get 19, 20%. What kind of power does that bring to them? What pressure can they bring to bear on the other parties with a larger majority in Parliament? Or does it mean
Well,
basically the same as before?
I think that they might end up getting 30%. I think
Really?
20 might be an understatement. And I think that the larger a party gets, the more leverage they're going to have with negotiations, with intimidating other parties that you might want to stand with us because that's the losing side right there. In order for, let's say, Jimmy Åkesson, the leader of the Sweden Democrats, in order for him to be a prime minister, there has to be like a larger coalition agreement. So that's probably not going to happen now. But what's going to happen is that they're going to have even more leverage than they did before. And that's going to send a strong signal to the other parties that if you want to get on the winning team, then you should really consider jumping on board here.
Now, you mentioned that they may get 30% in the vote. Obviously, the polls are showing around 20. Do you think that is the same reason we saw before Brexit? Obviously, the polls said that Remain was going to win. Obviously, a lot of polls said Hillary Clinton was 98% certain to win. Do you think part of that is the virtue signalling aspect or the fear of telling the pollster that they're going to vote for Sweden Democrats because they don't want them to know that, whereas actually when it comes to polling day, they are going to vote for them?
I think that in a country like Sweden, where there's such a strong tendency for self-censorship and a fear of social ostracization, when you have a party that's the absolute biggest taboo of all parties, then people probably aren't going to be as honest if they're interviewed over the phone by someone doing a poll. So I think that, yes, they are grossly underestimated, the polls. And I think that the media prefer to lift up polls where the Sweden Democrats are weaker rather than ones where they are stronger, because we've seen those as well. And I think this is because it has a psychological effect on people. You're seeing what other people are doing. You're seeing, like, am I alone in this? Is there a point, or is there a larger movement to jump on board here? So I definitely think it's a media game.
Yeah, there's obviously an incentive on behalf of the media, which is overwhelmingly left-wing, to disenfranchise people, to disincentivize people from voting if they think it's not going to have as big an effect. We saw that again with Brexit. Let's get into the crime. We're going to get into the new juicy rape statistics. I say juicy not because they're anything to celebrate, they're horrific, but it's so rare that we get them in Sweden, that's why they're of interest. Let's start off with the crime though, because again, they talked about this in The Spectator a few days ago. Murder is up 40% since 2012 in Sweden, according to this Spectator report. The number of gun homicides has more than doubled in 10 years. We see this increase in arson, 80 cars burned a few weeks ago in a few different cities. Grenade attacks on the increase. Nobody's saying Sweden is like Chicago, but it's getting worse, and this is why this election is so different. This is why the Sweden Democrats are doing so well. How much of this crime, how much of this violent crime increase is due to gang warfare, and how much is it due to, general criminality amongst migrants that has increased as the, quote, refugee migrant population has increased, and where do those two categories merge together?
Well, there's a lot of different things to keep in mind here. What you mentioned is primarily gang violence. It's not like ordinary people and immigrants are just going off of some kind of impulse to just burn cars. It's usually a specific category of people, so-called exclusion areas with people who are part of gangs and such. Murders, that's definitely connected to gangs. And car fires is also highly gang-related. When it comes to sex crime, well, there's a overrepresentation of non-Europeans per capita when it comes to assault, rape, gang rape, things like that, the worst kinds of sex crime. That's definitely important. That's not related to gangs, but it's still related to immigration. And when you look at gang criminality, there's been studies showing that the absolute majority of gang members today in modern Sweden are immigrants or second-generation immigrants. So it is very much connected to that. But it's also interesting how certain crime is going down, whereas other crime is going up. And what's happening is that the biggest victims here are women with sex crime and such. and immigrants, because it's immigrants who live in these ghettos where these shootings take place and where all this gang criminality and car fires is happening. So middle class white Swedes probably aren't going to notice much of a difference, but women and immigrants in ghettos definitely are. So what we're going to see here is a kind of, it starts in these specific concentrated areas, but the worse it gets, the more it's going to move out into the public and into nicer neighborhoods as well. So definitely connected to immigration, but it's not going to be noticeable in all facets of society.
Yeah, similar situation in London. Obviously, we have a violent crime on the increase, but it mainly affects gang members killing each other. That's frankly why a lot of people don't care about it. It's also interesting if you study the acid attacks in London. A lot of people presume that they're, Islamic attacks on other people or, Muslim gang members attacking each other, when it's actually mainly black gang members who are mostly British citizens. So, yeah, it's similar in a way, but let's get into these rape stats because we had new ones recently. 58% of convicted rapists and 85% of all convicted assault rapists were born outside of Europe. This is rapes in Sweden. In cases where the victim did not know the attacker, the proportion of foreign offenders was more than 80%. That was the big standout one for me. Nearly 40% of the convicted rapists are from the Middle East or Africa. We had a story, I did a story a few weeks ago or a few months ago, where police, after a woman was raped in one town, told women not to go out late to avoid being raped. They withdrew those comments after the controversy, but it gives you a picture of how the police are treating this now. Sweden has a self-proclaimed feminist government, which you've talked about a lot. You'd expect them to care about protecting women from rapists, right? But correct me if I'm wrong, they didn't seem too interested in addressing these recent rape statistics, right?
Exactly. This number, 58% of rapists, that's from Uppdrag Granskning. That's our public service media. So that's a mainstream media source. It's been really interesting lately. I mean, a lot of people ask me, why is Sweden so crazy and why are Swedish people such sissies? Well, it's not like they have been given many options historically. It's like the philosophical dilemma of Plato's cave. If you've only been presented with one version, then you're not going to be aware there's other things happening. So the Swedish media have been very good at covering up anything remotely negative about our immigration policy. But then the alternative media came along and started getting more traffic. They started getting more popular. So the mainstream media were forced to change their business model. So now they present racist hate facts like the ones you've mentioned constantly. And what happens then is that the Sweden Democrats shoot up in the polls because it's not like Swedish people are stupid and hopeless. It's just that they've been made unaware. But now that they are unaware, that's looking to change. And when it comes to the number of 58%, that's really interesting because I made a video 2 years ago where I went over all of the information that you can find in Sweden on this. And my estimation was that immigrants make out 20% of the population, but are responsible for 50% of the country's rapes. Then the media comes out 2 years later and says that, oh, wait, it's even worse. So it's kind of sad how people in Sweden can stay more updated following my YouTube channel than listening to the mainstream media. And I'm going to assume it's the same thing with you and Britain and anyone living in America.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting what you said, though, that to remain somewhat relevant and to capitalize on the business model of talking about violent crime and rape in Sweden, the media had to tell the truth about it to some extent. That was interesting. Okay, so I've seen you get frustrated by this, Vlad, and I get frustrated by it too, because people say it about a lot of different countries. Obviously, different countries are further along in terms of their societies falling apart in certain aspects. We're by no means in an apocalyptic situation yet, but you get a lot of people saying, France is gone, Germany's gone, Sweden's gone, they're finished, there's no hope. Even though such a thing is completely unquantifiable, like how could you even quantify if a country is finished unless it's literally like the USSR and has politically collapsed or whatever. But, according to Douglas Murray in Strange Death of Europe, Swedes will be an ethnic minority within our lifetimes. This is obviously going to impact society massively, no matter what side of the divide you're on. Can all these people really be integrated into Swedish society? Or are we looking at, over the next couple of decades, kind of the emergence of parallel societies in Sweden, which, to be honest, in some areas of London, we're already starting to see where, entire areas are governed differently. The behaviour that is expected of people in those areas is completely different. Are we going to see parallel societies based on demographics as part of this change brought about by mass uncontrolled immigration?
Well, if nothing changes, then we're heading towards a very brutal and unpleasant future. When it comes to people who are hopeless, talking about how everything is doomed, everything is over, those people need to ask themselves, who benefits from that attitude? Because we don't benefit from it. The only ones who benefit from hopelessness are your opponents. Now, even if Swedes were to become a minority in their own country, that doesn't mean it's over. Black people in America have been a minority, and they fought for their rights. They got rights. Now, whites are becoming a minority in America in a few decades. So it's never over until we say it's over. But we're definitely looking at huge challenges. And that's why I'm saying Sweden Democrats need power now. We need to close the borders now and probably kick out a lot of people who aren't real refugees. Because there's been estimations made that at least half of all migrants in Europe are financial ones. They're not actual refugees. So there needs to be action now. Otherwise, we are looking at everything becoming worse. Now, when it comes to for example, people often reason that, well, most of them aren't like that. Most blacks are fine, most Muslims are fine, most migrants are fine. Now, that is true. The problem is you don't need a majority for change. In fact, it is minorities that have driven change through history a lot of times. The Nazis were a minority. So were the civil rights movement. It works both ways, both good and bad. And when you have a minority of Muslims and immigrants who, we were talking about rape statistics earlier. I think that rape statistics are as high as they are. I think that immigrants are overrepresented as highly as they are because of culture, because they view non-Muslims as less worth. That's why the victims are often white women. Swedish women. In Denmark or Norway, for example, the police released a report showing that non-Europeans are heavily overrepresented, and their victims are almost always Norwegian women. So when you have a radical minority that hates white people, basically, as immigration grows, that minority will grow as well. Whereas Swedes are becoming smaller and smaller. So what's going to happen eventually is that Swedish people are going to be as big as the small chunk of bad apples from the immigrant group. So even if most immigrants are fine, there's still a huge problem with making that group larger and not aiming for assimilation. Because Sweden, as it is right now, does not have any demands on immigrants to become Swedish, to adapt Western values. We don't even have any kind of system for welfare, for example. Welfare is granted to anyone, even illegals. There's no like, if you want welfare, then you're going to have to sign a Swede contract and certain values. There's no system like that. So we're not giving people an incentive to respect Swedish citizens, the Swedish culture, and the Swedish nation.
Yeah, and when we talk about these issues of diversity and multiculturalism, I say multiculturalism has failed based on what it is and the reality of how it manifests itself in society. I think most leftists think about these words, these buzzwords, diversity, multiculturalism, and they think of their nice, middle-class, educated immigrant friend who they work with, who they go out to drink with, who they go to meals with, who is nice, pleasant, doesn't commit crime, integrates very well. They live in such bubbles that they don't realize that's not the diversity that we're dealing with. That's not how multiculturalism works with mass migration. How do you think they justify this in their heads? How do you think they see the brazen increase in crime, the brazen threat to women on the streets? They see that diversity and multiculturalism, as it impacts society, in reality, is clearly not working. And I guess this manifests itself in these studies. I think the most recent one, 2% of politicians in Sweden, and it's similar across Europe, who advocate mass immigration, only 2% live in immigrant-heavy areas. And you see that definitively in London with the biggest celebrity virtue signalers. Even though there are many areas in London, I live in one which is quite mixed. You know, just because it's mixed, where I live there's a lot of black people, there's some Muslims, a lot of white people. Just because it's mixed doesn't mean it's a bad area to live. It's a pretty good area to live. But they always choose the whitest areas possible to live with the least amount of migrants. Why do you think this is, and how do you think the left justifies all these clear problems in their heads and still vociferously virtue signal about diversity and mass immigration?
Well, I think that white flight is a documented issue. When too many non-whites or just people who are outside of your own race, so to speak, move into a neighborhood, then white people run away because fundamentally everyone is a little bit racist. There's a certain in-group preference.
Speak for
That
yourself.
doesn't mean that doesn't mean that you dislike black people or don't want them to have rights or don't want them in your country. It's more that you might not want to, you just don't want to be a minority in your own neighborhood, in your
Plus,
own
it's
country.
just like who you grew up with and who your friends were, which, within group preference, it's more typical to be your own race. It's just as simple as that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, if this were to happen to other countries, there would be a whole different narrative. There would be a whole different discussion. Nobody would accept that African countries are like becoming less African. Nobody would accept that
Well,
African people
Africa won the
become.
World Cup, didn't they?
Well, nobody would accept that Japan is made up of 20% Japanese people, or that Nigeria is only made up of 20% Nigerians. People would look at that and think that it's creepy. And the same thing applies to European nations. It doesn't mean that black people are racist. It doesn't mean that Asians are racist. It just means that there's a healthy balance and a middle ground between having good immigration and way too much immigration, to the point where it's not even immigration anymore. It's almost like an invasion. There's a subtle difference there. And I think when it comes to people like that, I know from my experience arguing with cultural relativists, for example, they're not even aware of the cultures that they are defending. They haven't read up on, for example, female genital mutilation or honor killings or things like that. They haven't read the opinion polls on the Arab world where a majority of Arab men think it's legitimate to harass a woman if she's dressed too sexy. Things like that. These people aren't even aware of these studies, probably because they consider it hate facts. So they think that they probably truly believe that all cultures are equal, but that's because they don't have any experience with these cultures. It's just trendy to be this cosmopolitan, tolerant liberal when there's never really a demand to live up to that stereotype. There's so many celebrities going out and being pro-migration. None of them are taking in immigrants in their huge mansions. If you were truly humanitarian and cared so much about refugees, you would let them live with you. But what something that's happened when people, and this ties into what we were talking about earlier with the rise of the Sweden Democrats. Something really interesting happened in Sweden in 2015 with the refugee crisis. Refugee crisis. There was this the left party they enacted a proposition which was accepted by government, and so every municipality in Sweden took in migrants, took in refugees. So what happened then is that every municipality, every city in Sweden finally got to experience what we've been warning people about. Now, when every municipality in Sweden accepted immigrants, they also accepted gang rape and assault rape and robberies and all kinds of crime and integration issues and Sharia police and all kinds of problems that they basically never had to experience before. It's really easy to be tolerant and pro-immigration when you don't actually spend time around these immigrants that you have taken in and live in these areas where their cultures are more dominant. So I think it's a typical issue of the lack of self-distance, which is typical for human beings.
Yeah, you talked about they don't have to live around these immigrants, which is always ironic when they accuse working class white people of being racist, because those are the people who actually do live in communities with immigrants. And it's interesting, in the area I live, there's a lot of poor people, mainly black people. There's a lot of rich white people. The area that I live in voted 70% Remain, so they're big virtue signalers. They support mass immigration. But when I go out into the park near where I live, and the school kids are all out on their little afternoon trip to the park, it's either all white kids in one group of school kids, or it's mixed Muslim and black kids. So the big virtue signalers, the leftists who, virtue signal about how pro-mass immigration they are, if they can send their white kid to the whitest school possible, because they can normally afford to, then they do. They don't follow through on it. The other aspect is the this disconnect between treating Islam in the West as some brave virtue signaling minority protected status group. And the thing with the hijab really gets me, because simultaneously you have the hijab elevated as some brave symbol of female empowerment, of feminism in some cases. Meanwhile, literally in Indonesia, in Iran, they're whipping women on the streets if it slips. They're arresting women in Iran, taking them to jail, torturing them. In fact, I posted a meme today which was the Muslim athlete with the hijab, with the Nike hijab, the infamous Nike hijab that they designed for Muslim athletes. And it said, just do it, brackets, so long as you've got your husband's permission. So that kind of gets to the disconnect there. Let's get more into that now, though. Now, let's talk about heritage, because we had a story a few months ago, in fact, it's probably last year, where Sweden hired this Muslim migrant. His name was Qasim Mahmoud. He was appointed head of the National Heritage Board. He admits he hasn't read anything about Sweden's cultural heritage. He admits that, so he says that Swedes who want to protect their culture are probably racist. This is not a direct quote, but it's paraphrasing what he basically said. He says, cultural traditions, quote, hide hideous motives. We see this in art galleries, we see it in art, we see it in the culture. This denigration of Western culture, this obsession with anti-colonialism. I was talking to you earlier about a model here in London who told me, a model who is typically white, very blonde hair, she can't get jobs in London as a model, or she struggles to, because they want somebody who looks ghetto. So now we see actual discrimination against white people because they look too white. And as you said, it's kind of this fetishization of Islamic culture, of minority culture, to the detriment of white people. So get into that, because you made a video about this ancient relic find, which ties into this in Sweden, right, a few months ago.
Well, it's also a fetishization and denigration of immigrants. I don't think immigrants appreciate being treated like objects. I know I don't. And I think they want to be praised on their ability and not on their skin color alone. So affirmative action and diversity quotas are offensive to immigrants themselves. If there ever was an opinion poll on what immigrants and non-whites think about this stuff, I don't think it would be a very popular idea. But yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. I did a video on this called Imperialist Multiculturalism, or Multiculturalist Imperialism, because that's basically what it is. I discovered that there's this huge social justice insanity wave sweeping across Swedish museums, where, I mean, the point of a museum is to preserve cultural heritage. But the people running Swedish museums don't believe in cultural heritage because it's racist. So they are using museums to try and enforce this multicultural narrative and say that, oh, look, there was a woman there and a Muslim there, so everything you know about the world and history is wrong. And it gets really, really weird when you have, like, there, for example, Sweden is melting down Viking artifacts to scrap metal, partially to save money, because it's just not a high financial priority in Sweden, or a political priority to preserve our cultural heritage, but also partially because there is this narrative that anything Swedish is worthless, it's not exciting, it's not interesting, so everything must be multicultural because they're the ones with the culture, we don't have any culture. That's definitely going on. And it's weird how the leftist warriors have infiltrated every institution, even the ones that kind of should have a nationalist perspective organically. For example, archaeology. I mean, you can't really research the history of different people and their cultures without acknowledging that they exist to begin with.
Yeah, and it's literally like a rewriting of history. To try and win a modern argument that they couldn't otherwise win about, oh, we've always been a nation of immigrants, without getting to the basic point. Some immigrants are better than others. Yes, some countries have been nations of immigrants. Britain was not that. Immigration was always gradual. They had a BBC cartoon series, which the media attacked me for, which said, this is the typical Roman family in Britain. It was a black family, okay? So that is not a typical Roman-looking family in Britain. Were there black people or brown people in Britain at that time? Some scattered around, yes. Was that a typical Roman family? No. But they made the argument, the non-argument, that because there were a few brown people in England at that time, that I was the erroneous racist or whatever. So it is a literal rewriting of history. I want to get into the hate speech angle now, though, because there's obviously this big spooky atmosphere in Sweden about talking about any of these subjects. Maybe it's gotten a little better, as you mentioned before, in recent months, given they actually got these rape statistics and people can talk about this a bit more now. But I've done several articles. I'll read out some of them. A 64-year-old man in Sweden convicted of hate speech for posting a satirical cartoon that made fun of Islam. So it's not, they don't just get banned on Facebook, they literally get prosecuted. There was a woman who was interrogated, I did a story about this, by the police because she said she didn't support multiculturalism. She had her DNA taken and put in a criminal database. She posted a joke meme about Islam. That was her crime. I could go through a lot of these. Peter Springhair, the police chief there, he was under investigation for merely observing that foreign-born offenders are largely responsible for the country's gang rape problem, even though that's a complete fact. It's what you said before. It's hate facts. Literally, PewDiePie was put on this hate list. Because, God knows why, because he was embroiled in the whole contrived Nazi controversy. But how bad is the persecution for this, for these thought crimes, simply to talk about these issues in Sweden? And as a prominent commentator on this, have you personally received any kind of backlash from merely speaking about these kind of issues?
Well, it's an interesting issue because, first of all, people are going to be like, well, they're only getting prosecuted, not being convicted. Well, prosecution alone can be traumatic enough. It's not an incentive to speak freely if you're going to have to sit in court for months, not going to know what's going to happen to your life, not going to know if you're going to have a conviction that can ruin future job opportunities. The mere fact that we have a law like this is incentive enough against free speech. So that's bad enough. Now, when it comes to the practical danger, I've never been reported, but then again, I'm an immigrant. And what's funny about Sweden's hate speech laws is that it's supposed to protect minorities from the oppression of the majority. Well, I'm not the majority. I am a minority. So I think I can get away with a lot of stuff that, I mean, pure legally. But it's also interesting. There was a really good article recently where they discovered that half of all hate crimes in Sweden are happening against white Swedes. So that's something that I was talking about earlier. It's interesting how Swedish people are 80% of the country, and yet half of all hate crimes are aimed at them. Meaning,
now, do they include Jewish people in that white statistic? I'm figuring out they do, probably, right?
I think they were looking at, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. But what's interesting is that there is a no representation. I mean, clearly immigrants are meaner towards Swedes than vice versa if you have this half-half, one group is this big and one group is this small. And then when it comes to these hates, there's been an epidemic lately with these court cases, and it's primarily elderly women who are being prosecuted. And the reason why is because elderly women, old people, pensioners, aren't as, they're more trusting of authority. They're more respectful towards the police. They're more likely to just kind of give in, say sorry, plead guilty, and get convicted. So the police are basically more interested in chasing old women posting semi-racist things on Facebook than chasing rapists at this point. And it's absurd.
Yeah, and from what I've read, they often get fined. They face the threat of jail. There have been several cases where they've been fined. And obviously, there was a 70-year-old Swedish woman who was prosecuted for saying that migrants set cars on fire, which again is another hate fact. She was prosecuted for that. And again, it's a trauma. Even if you don't get a criminal record or go to jail, that is a massive trauma for a 70-year-old woman who makes a comment on Facebook, then has the police knocking on her door. It's absolutely insidious. I wanted to get an update on that story, though, from I think it was about a month ago, actually. Pathological altruism. There was this pro-migrant campaigner. People have probably seen the video. I made a video about it. She got on a plane and prevented the plane from taking off because she wanted to stop the deportation of a migrant. It turned out about a week after that story, and she was heralded as this big campaigner, this big hero. The guy she protected had beaten up his wife and kids. He'd smashed his wife's head into the ground. He'd whipped his children with a power cord. I'm wondering, Vlad, if any Swedish mainstream media outlets revisited that story after these new details emerged.
Of course not. I mean, I found this out for the mainstream alternative media. The mainstream media made a lot of articles praising this woman, not as many pointing out these uncomfortable hate facts. And the guy who she protected, he was convicted of those terrible things, but he also wanted to go to Afghanistan. He wanted to be deported. He didn't want to stay in Sweden. So this woman basically just ruined a trip for a lot of people. Whereas if you look at Finland, this Green Party member there tried to do the same thing. She got kicked off after 5 minutes. She was kicked off immediately and arrested and prosecuted. Whereas in Sweden, this Swedish activist was allowed to stall a flight with several hours. And it's so disgusting when this type of stuff doesn't come out. So in one sense, yes, people like you and me and the alternative media are changing the way the mainstream media is acting. We are having an influence. At the same time, that doesn't mean the mainstream media has sobered up. they're still hiding uncomfortable facts from the public. In my perspective, the reason why they comment hate facts sometimes and do these red pill reports is just as a kind of quota to be able to say that, oh, well, see, we also tell the truth. But then they go back to their old pattern. And I think that journalism is having a kind of identity crisis where it's like, okay, do we make money off of racists and survive as a company? Or do we virtue signal? What's the best thing here?
It is often a money choice with a lot of these people. People have made that point with censorship as well. But we've done about 35, 40 minutes, so we'll leave it there. Just get your final comments and your prediction on the big election this weekend in Sweden. How do you think it's going to go?
Well, I think it's interesting because there's opinion polls in Sweden showing that over 50% of our country's population want to decrease immigration, ban Islamic prayer call, and ban Muslim schools. So the majority of Swedes have nationalist tendencies, but the majority of political parties don't. So I think that the Sweden Democrats are looking at very nice results, probably over 20% for sure. Otherwise, I would just be way too surprised. But I don't think this will lead to change immediately. I think it's going to take a long time, and I think everyone has a responsibility as a consumer to choose what they want to throw their money at. So you got to make sure to not fund, when the mainstream media does clickbait articles, make sure to, if you're going to share the article, share a print screen. Don't give them clicks. Don't give them ad revenue. And make sure to put your money where your mouth is and fund people who try to get the truth out about these things.
So Sweden Democrats, what are we saying? 20%, 25% would be a good result, right?
I wouldn't be surprised if they got 30%, but they probably will get 25, 23, 20, somewhere around there. I think that's a more realistic estimation. And I think it's going to take time before they get real influence. But I also think that the more the other parties are counteracting them, the more popular they're going to get the next election. So if it keeps up, then it's just a matter of time before they get 51% of the votes or something.
All right, we'll leave it there. Big Swedish election this Sunday. The Angry Foreigner. Links in the description below. Go and subscribe to the Angry Foreigners channel. And Vlad, thanks for joining me today on this show. Thank you.
Thank you for the platform.
Please click the big red button to subscribe. It really helps me when you do that. And click the bell to allow notifications so you never miss a new video.